A very good day to one and all who have joined us today. Our honorable guest, Shri Gopal Subramaniam, Senior Advocate and former Solicitor General of India, Professor Dr. Raman Mittal, Professor in charge of Campus Law Center, Dr. Seema Singh, Faculty Convener of Debate and Discussion Society of Campus Law Center, respected faculty members, guests, students, and all the viewers and audience. A very warm welcome to the much awaited session of Courtroom Legends keynote series. I'm 𝐂𝐨𝐮𝐫𝐭𝐫𝐨, final year student at Campus Law Center and currently heading the Debate Society along with a fellow batchmate of mine, Mr. Vijay Pujari. On behalf of Campus Law Center and Debate and Discussion Society, I thank you all and foremostly our honorable guest, Mr. Subramaniam, for joining us today. It is a moment of pride and honor for all of us that our esteemed alumnus, Mr. Subramaniam, has graced us with his presence. To welcome our guest and to deliver his welcome address, I would like to open the floor to our arena of knowledge, our Campus Law Center's Professor in charge, Professor Dr. Raman Mittal. I yield the floor to you, sir.
Thank you very much, 𝐂𝐨𝐻. So, most respected Senior Advocate, Shri Gopal Subramaniam ji, my colleagues at the Campus Law Center, and very dear students. We have gathered this evening to listen to one of the most illustrious lawyers of our times on a topic which is so interesting and so invigorating at the same time. I would like to start my welcome remarks with a small story. Many, many years ago, in a faraway country, there was a young and famous painter. He was young, but had already become very famous, not only in his own country, but abroad as well. His talents were beyond comparison. So he decided to create a truly great portrait, a masterpiece, a lively portrait full of the joy of God. So he was in search of a man whose eyes radiated eternal peace and whose countenance exhibited the radiance of God. And so he set out to find someone whose face reflected the eternal, the ethereal light. Now to find a person who has the beauty of God is so challenging, so difficult, especially among us, the grown-up people, as we tend to lose our innocence as we grow in years. The artist roamed from village to village, from city to city, and from forest to forest in search of his subject. And at long last, he came across a shepherd with shining eyes, with a face and features that held the promise of some celestial home. Just a single look was enough to convince him that God was present in this young man. The artist requested the young shepherd, who readily agreed to be drawn upon a canvas. And in a few days, a masterpiece was made. Thousands of copies of the portrait were made and sold far and wide. People felt great gratitude just being able to hang the picture on their walls. It brought some unknown peace to their lives. Now, after a span of some 20 years, when the artist had grown old, and when he had become even more famous, he remembered about that portrait. So he decided to paint another portrait. His experience had shown him that life is not all goodness. Life is just not beauty alone. It has the other side of ugliness too. He was an old painter now, well experienced. He had already made a portrait of God some 20 years back. Now he wanted to draw up Satan as well, so that the two pictures could complement each other. So that with these two portraits, he could capture the whole spectrum of human life, the entire potentiality of human existence. The idea of painting a picture of Satan persisted in him, and he desperately wanted to portray the evil incarnate. Now that he sought a man who was not a man, but Satan himself. In search, he went to gambling dens, to bars, to madhouses. This subject had to be full of hell's bitter fire. His face had to show him all the evil that is ugly, that is sadistic, that is sinister. And after a long search, the artist finally met a prisoner in a jail. The man had committed 7 murders and had been sentenced to be hanged in a few days. Hell was evident in man's eyes. They sported hate and utter disgust. His face was the ugliest one that he could possibly hope to find. The artist then took permission from the jail authorities and began to paint him. In a few days, when he had completed the portrait, he brought out his earlier picture that he had made of cord some 20 years back and set it side by side of the new painting for contrast. It was difficult to assess which was better from an artistic point of view. Both were marvelous, both were masterpieces. The artist stood staring at both of them, and then he heard a sob. Someone was crying behind him. He turned and saw the chained prisoner crying, chained because the criminal was dangerous. The artist was bewildered. He asked, "My friend, why are you crying? Do these pictures disturb you somehow?" The prisoner said, "I have been trying to hide something from you all this time, but today I am unable to control myself. You obviously do not know that the first portrait that you drew some 20 years ago is also of mine. Both portraits are of mine. I am the same shepherd you met 20 years ago in the hills. I cry for my downfall in the last 20 years. I am fallen. I have fallen from heaven to hell, from God to Satan, from grace to deformity. I have fallen." We do not know, my dear friends, whether this story is true or false, but I think this is more true than truth itself. One thing is for sure, for certain, each man's life has 2 converse sides. 2 potentialities of everyone are possible. In every man, both God and Satan exist. In every man, there is a possibility of heaven and a possibility of hell. A bouquet of beautiful roses can grow in a man, and a heap of stinking mud can also pile up in him. Every man swings between these 2 extremes. Man can attain to either of these extremes. What is true for man is also true for countries. Friends, we have had a glorious past, a past of which we can be proud of. This is the land where Upanishads were created, where warriors like Arjun and Karna were born. A land which was known as the Golden Sparrow, a land where the best universities were stationed. But can we be proud of our present in the equal measure? Can modern India offer something to the world in the domain of knowledge to the world? We all know the answers. I need not say it. So in our own country, we have observed polarities. We must resolve to change ourselves. And how the Constitution of India can be the instrument of this desirable transformation is the subject matter of discussion today. Friends, we are extremely grateful to Senior Advocate Mr. Gopal Subramaniam for agreeing to address us on this very important topic of how our Constitution can be an instrument of this change, this welcome transformation. Thank you so much, and I welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Raman sir, for that thought-provoking story. It is my privilege and honor to have been given this opportunity to introduce Mr. Gopal Subramaniam today. Campus Law Center's one of the most revered alumnus, Mr. Subramaniam, is a world-renowned international commercial arbitrator and an internationally acclaimed jurist. No words will be able to define or to justify the might of Mr. Subramaniam. He was one of the youngest to be designated as a senior advocate by the Supreme Court of India suo motu. He was a champion representing Union of India as Solicitor General of India. His jurisprudential arguments not only held right to privacy as a fundamental right in Puttaswamy versus Union of India, but it also led on to landmark judgments in Nas Foundation and Joseph Schein case. He has defined and refined the ever so dynamic contours of constitutional law and criminal law of our country. He is a legend in every definition there is, and we all are blessed to have his honorable presence today. I yield the floor to Mr. Subramaniam.
Raman Mittal, Dr. Seema Singh, Kajal, and all my friends, I have been absolutely floored by the introduction which Dr. Raman Mittal advanced. I have known Dr. Raman Mittal since a few years. He happened to be one of the most important contributors to the development of the Indian Law Institute in those days. A scholar, a man of great persistence, and above all, as his introduction today revealed, a man deeply gifted with poetic impulse and creative imagination. His introduction is befitting the topic for today. His introduction carries with it a message of poignancy, the message of creativity, the message of kinetic potentiality, that potentiality which is capable of transforming and changing human lives, societies, countries. His introduction is really one of the finest introductions I've heard from a professor of law. It is as good as the painting which he spoke about. I now begin speaking about the Constitution as an instrument of change. In the contemporary imagination, constitutions are curious instruments, constructed to achieve ends seemingly at odds with one another. They must stabilize the society that they operate in and preserve its polity. They must endure. At the same time, they must also progress their parent society and polity. In effect, so many of the preoccupations of constitutional theory are in fact dialogues about the best path to harmonizing these two seemingly contradictory functions of the constitutions. This evening, I propose to reflect with you all on the life of the Indian Constitution and the purposes of the Constitution as they relate to the Constitution's endurance and enacting its programmatic call to change and to progress, to show that progressive change and constitutional durability are both mutually reinforcing ideals, and to show the interplay, I will dwell on two themes that have each preoccupied scholars of Indian constitutional law. The first theme is that of social revolution. The second theme is the values and priorities that the process of constitutional amendment under our Constitution expresses. Before I do so, let me present to you the case I urge in brief. The first of my ideas for this evening is a variation on the theme of progressive change through the vehicle of the written Constitution. It is the concept of transformational constitutionalism. Born in the post-independence and democratic states of the global South, this idea has come to inform and inflect discourses in constitutional law, and theory across the globe, including in the classical liberal orders of an earlier vintage in the United States and Germany. Its rise creates new and important reason for comparative constitutionalists to have serious regard to South Africa as well as our own country. I would argue that both countries are sites in which new important feats of constitutional imagination are underway, feats of applying the governance machinery to hastening the journey of entire nations towards material and relational dignity. Secondly, I will address some unique particulars of the social contract codified by the Indian Constitution, which have led scholars to give its main heart and purpose the name of social revolution. My aim is to show to you that through the nomenclature of transformational constitutionalism is new and happily received from the great strides made in South African constitutionalism, the elements of that very idea have always been deeply embedded in the Indian constitutional text and in its working since 1950. Thirdly, I will present to you the idea that our work as lawyers has weight through the everyday activity of reading and deliberating on the words in the Constitution we chose for our people, their collective moral vision, and through the courts we motivate the state and our societies to unmake the old and remake the material world into one we want to inhabit. In other words, I want to show that through legal reasoning, lawyers are the chief movers of transformational constitutionalism. My final idea, and the postscript I propose to end on, relates not to change, but rather to the endurance of our constitutional order. It relates to the special way in which our amendment process balances necessary permanence and necessary change. If the Constitution is to serve the instrument by which our commitment to justice, freedom, and equality is realized, we must protect and preserve its instantiation of these commitments from uprooting or erosion. So an unspoken minus premise of transformative constitutionalist project is that the defense of the universal, timeless fundamentals of the constitutional order is a continuing and ever-present task. Let us consider each of these ideas together. In South African constitutional thought, there has emerged a powerful body of arguments about the true nature and spirit of constitutions like ours, enacted after the jettisoning of an earlier oppressive legal order. These arguments posit that post-independence constitutions are signals and blueprints of the replacement of an old and alien order with an indigenous legal order that mandates the active pursuit of substantive equality and human dignity in material and moral terms for their constituent people. In India, many vestiges of the pre-independence order survive in statute and remain to be weeded out. A great many of them subvert the central constitutional premise of substantive equality for all in some ways. So it is only natural that when the Supreme Court has had occasion in recent years to consider questions bearing on equal citizenship, it speaks in the register of transformational constitutionalism. In 𝐿𝐺𝐿𝐴 versus Union of India, the idea of transformative constitutionalism is cast as the judicial posture by which Part 3 and its commitment to dignity in Articles 21 and also Articles 14 to 16 must dissolve and overcome highly unjust pre-independence continuities such as those codified into Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. On the historicity of the wrong the Constitution redressed in that case, the court says the following: Indian citizens belonging to sexual minorities have waited. They have waited and watched as their fellow citizens were freed from the British yoke, while their fundamental freedoms remained restrained under an antiquated and anachronistic colonial era law, forcing them to live in hiding, in fear, and as second-class citizens. But this case involves much more. The case is about an aspiration to realize constitutional rights. It is about a right which every human being has to live with dignity. It is about enabling these citizens to realize the worth of equal citizenship. Above all, our decision will speak to the transformative power of the Constitution, for it is in the transformation of society that the Constitution seeks to assure the values of a just, humane, and compassionate existence to all her citizens. 𝐿𝑣Ω was, in the eyes of the court, a dialogue about the transformative power of the Constitution. In recognizing the rights of the LGBT community, the Constitution asserts itself as a text for governance which promotes true equality. In the case concerning adultery, Joseph Schrein versus Union of India, we can truly appreciate the depths of the Supreme Court's commitment to vindicating human dignity and to the true equality it espoused in 𝐿𝑣Ω. The rationale in Joseph Schrein was as simple as it was elegant: equality of the sexes. If it is to deserve the name, must extend to all spheres of life. A necessary sequitur would be that the public-private divide cannot be invoked as a shield to the emancipation of women. The hallmark of a truly transformative constitution is that it promotes and engenders societal change. To consider a free citizen as the property of another is an anathema to the ideal of dignity. Section 497 of the Indian Penal Code denies the individual identity of a married woman based on age-old societal stereotypes which characterize women as the property of their spouse. It is the duty of this court to break these stereotypes and promote a society which regards women as equal citizens in all spheres of life, irrespective of whether these spheres may be regarded as public or private. Women are again the focal point of the Supreme Court in the Sabarimala case, Indian Young Lawyers Association versus State of Kerala. In disallowing a discriminatory practice based on certain essentialism connected to the human body, the Constitution's purpose was seen not simply as transformation, but as radical social and political transformation oriented towards the final object of ameliorating the rights-bearing Indians' position. The Constitution was brought into existence to oversee a radical transformation. There would be a transformation of political power from a colonial regime. There was to be a transformation in the structure of governance. Above all, the Constitution envisages a transformation in the position of the individual as a focal point of a just society. Fundamental to the framers' vision was the ability of the Constitution to pursue a social transformation. As to the character of the transformation we must pursue, the Supreme Court is clear that it must be of a kind that maintains and enhances individual human dignity. What transformation in social relations did the Constitution seek to achieve? What vision of society does the Constitution envisage? The answer to these questions lie in the recognition of the individual as the basic unit of the Constitution. The view demands that existing structures and laws be viewed from the prism of individual dignity. This progressive impulse enlivens not only questions relating to gender or to sexual identity, but also to the persisting problem of social and economic disparities among citizens on the basis of caste. on the question of reservations in promotions in Pavitra versus Union of India, the court, speaking through Justice Chandrachud, has argued that such measures are supported by the framers' intent. There is substantial evidence that the members of the Constituent Assembly recognized that, one, Indian society suffered from deep structural inequalities. Two, the Constitution would serve as a transformative document to overcome them. One method of overcoming these inequalities is reservations for the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes in the legislatures and state services. The spirit of the famous of undoing profound and deep-rooted injustices is an important feature of the transformative constitutionalist outlook. In an important volume, and one of the many important volumes which Professor Bakshi has composed, and I am very privileged to announce to all of you that I'm a humble but a very, very proud student of Upendra Bakshi. He noted the therapeutic dimension of transformational constitutionalism. Professor Bakshi, who I would always rate as someone who could stand along Rawls, who could stand along Roscoe Pound, who could stand along Ronald Dworkin, he explains the framers' trailblazing adoption of an action-minded approach to removing historical discrimination in the following way, and I quote him: "The Indian Constitution frontally addresses millennial wrongs such as untouchability. Indeed, the Constitution is transformative on this normative register. It is historically the first modern constitution not merely to declare constitutionally unlawful the practice of discrimination on the ground of untouchability, Article 17, and of agrestic serfdom, described as a human right against exploitation, Articles 23 and 24. A unique feature of these provisions consists in the creation of constitutional offenses, even to the point of derogation of the design and detail of Indian federalism, because Article 35 empowers a parliamentary override over the legislative powers of the states within the Indian Union. So far, I have claimed that transformational constitutionalism was born in post-independence India and post-apartheid South Africa. Both had to confront and undo the wounds of the past before true freedom and equality could be pursued. But transformational constitutionalism is not concerned with the continuing effects of the injustices of the past alone. It is concerned with change and moral progress in the present and the future, with the ultimate end of advancing justice and rights for all. To return to Justice Chandrachud again in Navtej, it is difficult to right the wrongs of history, but we can certainly set the course for the future. That we can do by saying, as I propose to say in this case, that lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgenders have a constitutional right to equal citizenship in all its manifestations. The constitutional values of liberty and dignity can accept nothing less. In addition to this course setting for the future, transformative constitutionalism entails looking forward in an even more important way. As Justice Pius Langa, a former Chief Justice of the South African Constitutional Court, puts it, transformation is not a temporary phenomenon that ends when we all have equal access to resources and basic services, and when lawyers and judges embrace a culture of justification. Transformation is a permanent ideal, a way of looking at the world that creates a space in which dialogue and contestation are truly possible, in which new ways of being are constantly explored and created, accepted and rejected, and in which change is unpredictable, but the idea of change is constant. Constitution as not transformative because of its peculiar historical position or its particular socio-economic goals, but because it envisions a society that will always be open to change and contestation, a society that will always be defined by transformation. I made a bold claim earlier this evening that India can also claim authorship of the idea and practice of transformational constitutionalism. Let me give some grounds for this claim. Two features of Indian constitutionalism signal its progressive character. The first is the Constitution's textual commitment to substantive equality and to the uplift of a country which needed to regenerate after its independence. The second is our express embrace of social revolution. The bridge between the South African sensibility and our own can best be expressed in Chief Justice Langa's conception of transformation. He says that transformation is a social and an economic revolution. Our framers' first priority was no more and no less than to set such a revolution into motion by the enactment of our Constitution. Without freedom from want and some minimal guarantee of food, shelter, and the like, no pursuit of true human dignity and freedom can succeed. An acute awareness of the need for the Indian Constitution and the whole edifice of the state that it would create to attend to providing some commitment to socio-economic subsistence for all is patent in Part 4 of the Constitution. In fact, the main ambition of the Constituent Assembly, in Jawaharlal Nehru's words, was to secure a freedom from want that so many impoverished Indians suffered. He said that the first task of this assembly is to free India through a new constitution, to feed the starving people and to clothe the naked masses, and to give every Indian the fullest opportunity to develop himself according to his capacity. This is certainly a great task. Look at India today. We are sitting here and there in despair in many places and unrest in many cities. The atmosphere is surcharged with these quarrels and feuds, which are called communal disturbances. And unfortunately, we sometimes cannot avoid them. But at present, the greatest and most important question in India is how to solve the problem of the poor and the starving. Wherever we turn, we are confronted by this problem. If we cannot solve this problem soon, all our paper constitutions will become useless and purposeless. Keeping this aspect in view, who could suggest to us to postpone and wait? In the mind of its chief architect, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and I would like all my friends to make a commitment that before they join the bar, they access a website of the Government of India, which has published the complete works of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. And if you even go through some of those pages, you will understand why he makes such a deep and great impression on all of us. And in his mind, the problems of poverty and caste discrimination were so serious that they would imperil the democratic form of government that Indians had given to themselves. Just as Dr. Raman Mittal spoke about God and Satan, he remarked on our life of contradictions as follows. On the 26th of January 1950, we are going to enter into a life of contradictions. In politics, we shall be recognizing the principle of one man, one vote, one value. In our social and economic life, we shall, by reason of economic structure, continue to deny this principle. How long shall we continue to live this life of contradiction? If we continue to deny it for long, we will do so by putting our democracy in peril. Many of these thoughts are so poignant, particularly during the COVID-19 crisis, which I'll speak about a little later. I will return to this question of our constitutional law's approach to poverty again. It is often forgotten that our framers took a wholly unprecedented and trailblazing approach to constitutionalism. At the time, to take the Constitution and make it an instrument, not just of advancing us towards justice, of bending the arc of our history, to put it in Martin Luther King's words, but to suggest that the Constitution must itself be the vehicle and author of transformation and even of revolution, was truly extraordinary. Until the Indian Constitution, the conventional wisdom was that constitutions were bulwarks against change. They are usually put in place after a period of bloody upheaval, often war or revolution, as was the case of the United States, France, Japan, or Germany. They are lodestars of stability and continuity. Our example turned this notion on its head. Born through a peaceful transfer of power, the Constituent Assembly fashioned a vehicle for the very outcome other constitutions sought to prevent: a wholesale social and economic revolution. South Africa's post-apartheid constitution is one among many new states to validate the power of this conception of constitutions. In contemporary times, there is another reason to celebrate and admire our Constitution's foresight. Everywhere today, the preoccupation with economic inequality abounds. It seems to be the singular and root problem of our times. Few liberal and democratic constitutions of their time open the field to the welfare state and adopt such an active posture to the problem of poverty as did ours. A vast number of decisions under Article 21 adopt the sensibility to affirm such essential guarantees as the right to food and to health. In recent years, the social justice bench of the Supreme Court has attended to such symptoms of acute poverty as homelessness through the call for the provision of night shelters in winter. Numerous constitutions, including that of the United States, continue to fall short on acknowledging and addressing the ways in which acute poverty can strip us of our freedoms. The conventional understanding throughout history has been that the problem of poverty is unsuited to the courtrooms and to the particular tools and methods of ordinary adjudication. Lon Fuller argued that this was because of its extreme complexity, or in his words, polycentricity or many-centeredness. In the incremental successes that social action litigation has shown in India and in other countries as far-flung as Latin America, which have been inspired by it, Indian constitutionalism, striving for progressive change, upended yet another element of global historical assumption about the constitutions to engender material justice. To properly appreciate how constitutions, mere words after all, trigger meaningful change in our societies, it would be useful to begin at the most quotidian of activities that we as lawyers participate in, the interpretation of legal texts. In The Descent of Man, Charles Darwin affirms for us the abiding power of the human imagination. He says that the imagination is one of the highest prerogatives of man. By this faculty, he unites independently of the will former images and ideas, and thus creates brilliant and novel results. I want to put to you that all the methodology and practice of transformational constitutionalism consists of applying imagination to the legal reasoning in which we engage every day. Powerful as the words of the Constitution are, their capacity for meaning making and for social, economic, and political transformation can only be harnessed by bringing them to bear on the injustices of our time through our hands, lawyers' hands, and the hands of young, aspiring law students. If I could break away from my speech, I want to tell you my first tryst with the law was actually as a student of law. Again, I salute that wonderful professor, Professor B.B. Pandey, with whom we all used to walk every Saturday afternoon to a court which used to be called as the Beggars' Court. That was our tryst with the law. A magistrate used to be actually allocated the duties of hearing the applications to be set at liberty. And we used to fill up as young law students applications literally as their next friends. It was indeed, and it was a very defining moment, at least for me, in my career. Transformational constitutionalism is the pursuit of the brilliant and novel results that Darwin sees human imagination capable of producing when we direct our imaginations towards justice. Our courts are an important site in which the Constitution's promise of transformation can be brought alive. As Karl Clare, who theorized the subject of transformational constitutionalism in a seminal 1998 article, Legal Culture and Transformative Constitutionalism, would put it, we may legitimately expect constitutional adjudicate to innovate and model intellectual and institutional practices appropriate to a culture of justification. A humane and imaginative approach has always characterized the Supreme Court's treatment of cases concerning individual dignity. One need only refer to how it has pressed Article 21's moral heft into service, along with the transformative vision of Part 4, in order to secure basic subsistence rights to Indians in need of food, shelter, and water. In addition to producing just and humane outcomes of this kind, the court has also developed methods by which to reason towards transformative justice in cases where the plain meaning of constitutional text does not yield an immediate or obvious route to just outcomes. Two important devices have been crafted by our Supreme Court to channel our efforts in bringing imagination to legal reasoning on the words of the Constitution. The first is the idea of constitutional morality. The second is the beautiful and evocative metaphor of the Constitution as a living tree. Well, we now know in modern neuroscience that our brain have so many billions of neurons, they are also called trees. Both are powerful resources for the transformative constitutionalist project. They offer us a way in which to exploit the open texture of the law in a way which brings us nearer to the full enjoyment of the dignity and freedom that the Constitution's text assures us, and also to argue for the endurance of its animating values. What do we mean by open texture? Open texture is simply a way of conveying that all language, including the written word of the law, is elastic. Every law has words, which words can be stretched to take in circumstances unknown to those who drafted the law. Every legislator enters the black letter of the law, but is supple enough to retain its core purpose and principle while stretching to take in new circumstances. That is how statutes survive over time. In the storied chapter 7 of his concept of law, the noted Oxford legal positivist 𝐂𝐨𝐻𝐿 Hart explains how the words of the law respond to change. When we word the legal rules that bind us in general terms, they're capable of attending to a great number of particular circumstances that arise over time. This, Hart posits, is because of language. As a fellow Oxford don by the name of Frederick Wiseman, known for his work on the philosophy of language, theorizes as open texture. Because of the open texture of legal language, the simple efflux of time, coupled with a spirit of compassion and justice, can yield sweeping constitutional transformations. Consider the history of the conception of the person in law, and in charters of rights more particularly. This conception would decide who enjoys rights. This is a very telling part of the intellectual history of constitutions and of rights. Written into the Magna Carta was at that time a limited applicability to noblemen. Grand as its proclamation of rights was, at a certain time only a few select and privileged could enjoy them. But in more recent history, it is actually an article and creed of faith and the supremacy of the law being proclaimed for all. Then in more recent history, there was the dehumanization of black slaves as a feature of American law. Their constitution in its original form included the 3/5 compromise in Article 1, Section 1, Clause 3, by which the enslaved black persons in a state would be counted as 3/5 of the number of white inhabitants of that state for the purposes of deciding the quantum of representation it would have in the US Congress. It was not until the 14th Amendment that this grotesque notion was overcome, at least in formal law. Women were similarly excluded for the preponderance of historical time from being counted in the law's idea of persons. Indeed, at a global level, it was only by the intervention of Hansa Mehta, the Indian delegate to the UN Commission on Human Rights, 1947 to 1948, that Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights was altered from the opening phrase to its current non-discriminatory and expansive view of who is a bearer of the rights guaranteed by laws. Article 1 was initially worded as, all men are born free and equal. Today it reads, all human beings are born free and equal. Once again here, the Indian Constitution was unusual. At the time of its enactment, rather than decades or centuries after, as in the rest of the world, the Indian Constitution enabled, through the Representation of the People Act, a truly universal franchise by including adult women as eligible voters. Recently, in 2019, Richard Albert, a scholar of comparative constitutional law, made an unusual and important claim. He argued that most important part of a constitution is not its charter of rights or its institution of democratic government or of separated powers. It is the amendment procedure that it adopts. Albert is correct for two reasons. First, without securing the Constitution's core ideals and moral ethos from erosion, the transformative constitutionalist agenda would be unimplementable. And second, the very factum of an amendment procedure's existence invites and validates the transformative constitutionalist lawyer and the judge's efforts. As the noted American constitutional theorist Sanford Levinson argued in 1995, amendments are effectively acknowledgements of the imperfection of existing schemes of constitutional ordering and government. It has not been the historical default to codify a supple amendment procedure into constitutions. In fact, in the reckoning of the political theorists from whom modern constitutionalism flows, inalterability rather than responsiveness to change was prioritized. So, for example, John Locke drafted the 1669 fundamental constitutions of the Carolinas to include the following words: "These fundamental constitutions shall be and remain the sacred and unalterable form and rule of government forever." In the same spirit, James Madison wrote in the Federalist No. 49 that a reverence for the laws is necessary to a constitution's endurance, and that allowing amendment would carry an implication of some defect in the government. That sacralization, as Levinson calls it, of the United States Constitution has yielded an amendment procedure that is extremely unresponsive and rigid. By contrast, our Article 368 is stringent, but as our history shows, entirely workable. The key to unlocking it lies in finding in Parliament a high degree of deliberative consensus. There is an important value that transformative constitutionalists must take from this. The design and workability of our amendment provision is our framers' most express articulation that the Constitution's project is always to be a work in progress. Our Constitution's procedure for amendment codifies a radical and constructive departure from a commitment to rigidity and endorses a critical deliberation in our supreme and constant striving towards the constitutional ends. In fact, we could argue that there is a touch of Rousseauian ideal of human perfectibility in our Constitution's approach to amendment, as also to social revolution. In a 1754 discourse on the origins of inequality, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the celebrated social theorist, argued that human beings are distinguished from the other creatures with which they share the primeval world only by two characteristics: freedom and perfectibility. Freedom in this context is simply the ability not to be governed solely by appetite. Perfectibility is the capacity to learn and thereby to find new and better means to satisfy needs. Together, these characteristics give humans the potential to achieve self-consciousness, rationality, and morality. It is routine to proclaim the significance of Keshavananda, its entrenchment of the basic structure doctrine, but we need to remember that it is in fact a feat of constitutional imagination. There are universal and timeless ideals which make up the premises upon which the meat of the Constitution rests. These are ideas concerning the fundamental tenets of human nature and the factum of innate human worth. Richard Albert's 2019 work introduced the concept of constitutional dismemberment to scholarly discourse as a contrast to constitutional amendment. With the basic structure doctrine in place, our Supreme Court has given us an important device by which we can defend the essential and ageless elements of the constitutional fabric and draw the line between the two. The amendment procedures and the idea of basic structure should remind all who are committed to progressive lawyering and to transformative constitutionalism the nature of our Constitution and of our twofold duties. Our Constitution is exemplary. It offers unparalleled cognitive and moral resources by which to effect worthwhile changes in our material world. It actively enables the effort to put dignity, freedom, justice, and human flourishing within the reach of all. Thus, it is not enough to just strive to realize dignity, equality, and socio-economic rights. We must first and always defend from erosion the universal and timeless ideas that make this striving possible. Transformative constitutionalism begins only when we see ourselves as custodians of the basic structure. It is true that power arises from an asymmetrical interdependence. 𝐂𝐨𝐻𝐚 and Nye, in their celebrated work called Power and Independence, followed by Albert Hirschman's book, National Power and the Structure of Foreign Trade, refers to the political influence justified by an appeal to intuitively plausible ideas. This requires introspection, and above all, it must bear constitutional validity. Whether it be nations or individuals, new theory of economic dependence and its political use is a facet of all current history. Coercion, oppression, denial of rights can often be justified on the basis of economic growth and politically styled developmentalism. The pursuit of happiness can often be misunderstood as the strange struggle for power. Human power is different from market power. The negotiation of one's rights is not intended to be a struggle under our Constitution. Free speech and dissent are central to any democracy. The power of the amendment of the Constitution is an available resource, but must carefully and organically evolve out of history. Works of art, the freedom of expression, a free press, critical acculturation are some of the indicia by which the working of the Constitution and its success can be measured. While it is true that overdependence on any organ of the state is inconsistent with democratic dignity, the rule of law and the rule of constitutionalism place substantial value on judicial independence and for courts to review the actions of the executive and the legislature. Human dignity is not the maximization of discounts offered by any state to its citizens. It is more intrinsic in character. In his book Tyranny and Legitimacy, James Fishkin discusses the theory of choices and how certain choices can impose severe deprivations. The Constitution, while it offers hope, is also a document of caution. It is aware that any procedural principle, any theory of absolutism can legitimize arbitrariness and tyranny. The Indian Constitution is not simply inclusive because of a pluralist society, but the very idea of fraternity implies distributive justice in terms of the distribution of goods as well as services, including the promotion of well-being of all individuals. Some of the considerations which could accentuate arbitrariness may even remain anonymous and not transparent. The concept of the rule of law, as well as governance under the Constitution, is the negation of anonymity in governance. A simple act of redistribution can actually lead to retardation. The conditions which the Constitution contemplated for its citizens are those of happiness and optimization. This requires self-visitation by all institutions from time to time to analyze and reflect about their progress in terms of objective milestones of the furtherance of constitutionalism and the immanence of the rule of law. A developmental model of care is often a relevant consideration in a helpful state which is sworn to constitutionalism and its ability to collapse divisions based on boundaries. Practice of religion and faith, while being personal matters and choice of personal freedom, the state has to take utmost care that there is no semblance of any transgression. The promotion of personal freedom must be always in the direction of what is often referred to as mainstreaming under the Constitution. The work of Dr. Ambedkar in terms of anthropology and social anthropology in particular has had the most beneficent impact in the design of the Constitution, where the Constitution was a deliverer and a vehicle for emancipation. The Constitution was intended to be liberal because of the very nature of human freedom. And human freedom, after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, laid a premium on rational and humanistic foundations. At its core text, the Constitution concerns itself and promotes the human content above every other social factor and sanctifies life itself. This does require a robust approach on the part of the legal profession, whoever be its constituents. The effectiveness of the approach is only judged in retrospect and in history. But that is no invitation for not addressing the present. The remarkable changes wrought in social behavior by a pandemic placed the state in a more important and significant position of the health of its people, but nevertheless, new designs, new solutions, new possibilities always emerge out of periods of depression and disease. That can be achieved by not only transformational constitutionalism, but helpful perspectives of courts of justice to uphold the principles of equality and non-discrimination in changing times. When times change, equality and discrimination may acquire a different context. The rule of law and ever-vigilant courts are the only guarantee wherein the exercise of power there can be. Only guarantee against the exercise of power where there can be a subtle mixture of persuasion, manipulation, and a trifle of coercion. I thank all of you for listening to me so patiently. I thank Dr. Raman Mittal for that wonderful introduction. And Dr. Mittal, what you said in your introductory address is a piece of dynamic advice, very well delivered to your students, but more importantly to me, because I'm still a student of the Campus Law Center in the Delhi University. As I had this occasion, I can only pay a tribute to the professors of law who inspired me in my journey. I have mentioned Professor Upendra Bakshi. I have mentioned Professor B.B. Pandey. I want to mention Professor Lutika Sarkar, whose seminal work on equality and her knowledge of private international law, and being one of the first students in Cambridge who was called also to the bar, was an amazing teacher. Dr. D.K. Singh, who edited one of V.N. Shukla's books on constitutional law, was also a professor. Dr. Erabi, again, one of the greatest professors of constitutional law. Dr. Sivaramaya, who was again a magnificent professor of the law of contract. Dr. Sangal, who taught us the law of taxation. I will never forget any of the professors. I will not forget the building. I will not forget the rooms. I will not forget the seminar hall where once I spoke and I almost earned a scholarship to Harvard just because of an interjection in a question which I posed that day. I remember Dr. Veena Bakshi. I definitely remember all the professors, the wonderful deans, and the tradition which the Campus Law Center has maintained. As you said, Dr. Mittal, Delhi University is a gifted university. You know, this university had its first Vice Chancellor, who was the Chief Justice of the Federal Court, none other than Sir Maurice Ɡɣɪ, who was actually a passionate educator. And Ɡɣɪ's Hall is was rightly named after him. He was one of the most expansive liberal contributors, like many of the English justices who adorned the courts in India, contributed to the foundations of those institutions. As I mentioned in one of my other talks, India is the only country where we had judges of England who, after the Constitution came into force, adorned the offices of Chief Justices of High Courts, including Sir O.B. Miltham in Allahabad in 1960, and the last English judge who left the shores of India was a judge of the Indian Civil Service, Sir William Broome, in 1964. So there is a shared history between what many democracies have enshrined as the rule of law, the supremacy of the law, the importance of the principle of legality, the need for justification as a facet of reasonableness in judicially reviewing governmental and legislative actions. And indeed, our Constitution in the fundamental freedoms was in fact an inspirational constitution, as you could see later how the Human Rights Act became a part of the laws in the United Kingdom, and how fundamental freedoms acquired even a more robust shape. But thank you all for listening to me so patiently. I only have shared some ideas out of my sense of reflection. A point which you made, Dr. Mittal, times change. They pose new challenges. They pose challenges to individuals, whether we are lawyers, whether we are students of the law, whether we are judges. And one thing all of us must remember, we are accountable some way to ourselves, but when we are accountable to society, we also become accountable in history. Historical accountability is, of course, judged in more stringent, in more objective terms. And that is why it is very necessary for courts of justice to be always regarded as sentinels on the quive. That phrase which Chief Justice Patanjali Shastri used in his extraordinary judgment in V.G. Rao's case. So I leave you with these thoughts, and I'll be very delighted to take on board any questions, and I am completely patient, and I'll answer all the questions to the best of my ability. Thank you very much, Dr. Mittal, and thank you, Mr. Vijay Pujari and Kajal, for inviting me, and also Dr. Seema Singh, with whom I was able to have the privilege of a conversation. And my best wishes to you, Dr. Mittal. You are the professor in charge, so you are, in some sense, both the artist and the creator, and you're molding young minds, just as you molded the young students at the Indian Law Institute. You are here now, professor in charge of one of the most prestigious institutions of law, the Campus Law Center in the Delhi University. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the prodigious and the doctrinal keynote, sir. We have only heard and read about your monumentous present and masterful prowess in oration. I must admit personally, witnessing you live is empowering and overwhelming in equal proportions. I am Vijay Pujari, a final year law student of Campus Law Center, presently serving as student convener of the Debate and Discussion Society. And I am deeply honored to moderate this Q&A session, sir. With your permission, due permission to begin, I may, sir.
Please.
Yes. So the first question, so you extensively talk about South African Constitution, and I'm aware of the fact that you have great friends in the Constitutional Court of South Africa too. And the one commonality we share with South Africa is a colonial past. So am I right in saying that great constitutions have genesis or perhaps a resultant of an oppressive regimes?
I think the South African experiment was slightly, ever so slightly different, because it dealt with something as fundamental as apartheid. But what actually enabled the South African experiment, if I could call it, as an inspiring story was not simply the Constitution, and not simply the wonderful friends I have in the Constitutional Court of South Africa, whom I mentioned. And I definitely, again, two of my friends, Zak Yaqub, as well as Albie Sachs, very powerful, very inspiring, very motivating, as also Michael Kirby in Australia, deeply inspiring, deeply motivating. They're all centers and bundles of energy. But what made the South African experiment unique was actually Desmond Tutu. That was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That is when people faced each other. Because how do you dissolve differences without a certain face-off? In a spirit of civility, in a spirit of accommodation. And people who never spoke actually to people of another community were now waving to them. They were communicating with them. The art of communication, which Desmond Tutu established in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is actually a model for any pluralist society to understand that we are all fundamentally only human beings.
Thank you so much, sir. So, with respect to the Section 14 of the South African Constitution, right to privacy includes protection against search and seizure and privacy of correspondence. And when I draw an immediate parallel to it with respect to Puttaswamy, do you see Puttaswamy as a transient force or a destination that we have achieved?
I hope it is not transient. I hope it is a permanent writing on the wall. It is a great judgment because it is a 9-0 judgment. There is no dissent. And in the different opinions, you see different shades of approach to the same topic of fundamental human freedoms, space and freedom. That space and freedom, just like as a home is said to be a man's castle. That is actually, again, it's a phrase which Justice Rajagopal Iyengar actually referred to in Khadak Singh's case. But a man's soul can be bared only in privacy. A man's creativity can arise only in his mind. If an evolutionary biologist like Charles Darwin understood the great value of human imagination and what it can do to human beings, I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that without privacy, there cannot be imagination. And that is why the free speech which is protected under our Constitution, including works of art, is because of the fact that expression is itself a manifestation of the right of privacy matched in with creativity. So I do hope it is a destination which will never be departed from.
Thank you so much, sir. So 124.4 enables us to have a jurist as a judge of Supreme Court. What is stopping us in having people like Professor Mittal or Professor Bakshi as a judge of Supreme Court or High Court? And this is my personal indulgence, sir, because I feel that these are the people who are required at the Supreme Courts this present day.
I cannot agree with you more. I think the judiciary has lost out, in my view, a very important resource which was actually in front of it. And I personally think that the non-appointment of some of these very distinguished professors who would have brought about a certain kind of intellectual cross-fertilization of ideas, I think the court is possibly poorer for it. So I personally, I've always maintained that the names which you mentioned, Professor Bakshi, Professor Lutika Sakar, Professor Pandey, and in fact at one point of time, I must tell you, some of the judges considered a gentleman, I don't know whether many of you know, he's a lawyer, but he's essentially a jurist, 𝐂𝐨𝐮𝐫𝐿 Noorani. And 𝐂𝐨𝐮 Noorani, his writings and his knowledge of constitutional history was so intense that at that point of time they were thinking of him also as a possible candidate. But that's something not too well known. But I'm mentioning it that it is a resource which must be looked at as a possibility. Today, as you mentioned, Vijay, you have Dr. Raman Mittal, you have some of the very young, brilliant vice chancellors, most brilliant students you can ever imagine. And I don't see why. Why should we not have academics on the bench? Lady Hale, Lady Brenda Hale, the Chief Justice of the United Kingdom Supreme Court, one of the great Chief Justices, I would say, is an academic. She's actually an academic. And there is something about an academic which is so positive. And I think it makes a lot of sense to have, to use that article because it's a very important available resource. But we're talking about academics who have a universe of their own. They're not aligned to any governments or political, shall we say, a political ideology. They've got their own ideology. Their universes are so different. What makes Professor Bakshi so special? Actually, sometimes I wonder whether he has any extraterrestrial existence. I don't know if he's watching this talk of mine, but I hope he takes it in very good light, because he's the only one I know who is able to move or be mobile between different universes of schools and schools of thought. He's the only one I have seen who can move seamlessly between psychology and sociology and philosophy, and then bring in the Constitution as a perspective. And he's a man, I have never seen him repeat a speech. I have never seen him do what is called a cut, copy, paste, ever. So original, so original. So I completely understand that when he used to teach at Warwick, I think he possibly still teaches at the University of Warwick, people would wait for an opportunity to interact with him. A man with a great mind, absolutely great mind.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir, we have Surabhi Ghosh's question from our Facebook stream, sir. She is from University of Burdwan, West Bengal. And her question is, within the purview of transformative constitutionalism, is it impossible to make the basic structure theory dynamic?
The basic structure theory is in some sense terribly dynamic. It's such a brilliant question. Please congratulate her. Brilliant question. It is absolutely dynamic. Actually, that means the person has actually understood constitutional law. My God, this is a brilliant point. Basic structure was actually not a resistance to change. Basic structure involved the fundamental tenets of republicanism, democracy, and above all, fundamental freedoms of equality and non-discrimination. Anything which is non-discriminatory per se has to be dynamic. And that is why, as I said, in changing times, discrimination can be of a very different kind. Discrimination may be born out of prejudice. That is why why do we say that somebody must actually act without fear or favor? Because prejudice, bias, these are what we call as the unconscious entrance into our mind. And because we lead lives as human beings, it is necessary to have some ability to have mastery over them. In fact, as you speak about it, and what what Surabhi asked, there is a professor in Oxford who is actually a scholar in cultural psychiatry, and who once, in a very enlightening conversation, spoke to me about the importance of empowerment and the importance of choice. Empowerment and choice, what it can do to the mind, mental health, is so important. Let me give you a second example. Another professor from Cambridge, again a psychiatrist, he spoke to me about the world of perceptions in our brain, our body, which actually gets all the sensory information, and then our biases, which actually translated ultimately as some form of judgments. I think basic structure is pure dynamism. It is a recipe or a prescription for living. And that is why the word structure may give some sort of a meaning which is actually at odds with the real content of those rights. That's why one must look at the rights which constitute basic structure. One must look at the words which constitute basic structure. What is the importance of republicanism? Why did we use the word republicanism in the preamble of our Constitution? It was because we needed a completely neutral state, a state which will always maintain impartiality as its core tenet of governance. That is why republicanism was so fundamental. That is why our Constitution is one of the few constitutions which uses the expression freedom of conscience with the freedom of religion. And that is why we have a wide gamut of, shall we say, ethical, normative, individualistic determinations which lie within the broad gamut of freedom which has been given to us.
Thank you, sir. We can begin with the public questions, sir. We have Arif to begin with, sir. Arif.
How well is it justifiable to give judiciary the power, be it partial power, in the reference of Supreme Court, to omit, amend, or introduce new law, as judiciary is not directly accountable to the citizen as legislature is?
Well, this is a classic debate which has been going on. But if the Constitution has to be finally interpreted, the final interpreter of the Constitution happens to be the judiciary, because that is the scheme under the Constitution. And the scheme itself contemplates that judiciary is the final arbiter in matters of constitutional law. The question which you're asking is creativity permissible for the judiciary? I would say yes. In the Indian context, judiciary is not a mere policeman, that it simply looks at what is called separation of powers and maintains people within their respective boundaries. In the Indian context, judiciary has to be creative per se, because the avocation of adjudication itself is a craft. The avocation of adjudication is not simply about interpreting a text. It is actually, again, a calling. The calling of being a judge means you have new tools. You have negated yourself. You're starting on a clean slate. You're acquiring new forms of knowledge. You're acquiring light from all sides. So that is going to lead to creativity. That power we must always cede to the judiciary. It is only in areas which are purely policy oriented, where you can't second guess at all, because there can be two different views on policy, but that's a very different brand of areas, or those are different areas where judicially manageable standards may not be able to work. But if judicially reviewable standards can be discerned, and they can be discerned incrementally dependent on new situations. A COVID-19 has a completely different plethora of considerations, like COVID-19. So therefore, I think judiciary must be given that latitude. It is not latitude. I think it might be even obligation for the judiciary to be innovative in the Indian context.
So we have Toshita Joshi joining us for the next question. Toshita?
Sure.
Good evening, sir. So my question is that we've made 104 amendments in our constitution in the past 71 years. So by frequently amending our constitution, are we doing justice to the makers of the constitution? And also, are we sticking to the ideals of the preamble or not?
Any amendment which violates the preamble, Toshita, again a brilliant question. If it violates the preamble, the chances are it will be offending the basic structure. So it's a very, very thoughtful question. Yes, as I said, amendment can happen, but amendment must be born out of history. It must be born out of an organic evolution of the workings of the Constitution. It is not intended to abruptly, shall we say, emasculate constitutional protections. It may advance constitutional protections. It can improve on them. Like, for instance, we have 21A. The right to education, as you know, is a fascinating right. We have that now as a fundamental right in our Constitution. Although it took some prodding from the Supreme Court that the fundamental right was brought into force. But yes, if it does violate the preamble, my guess is it might, in all likelihood, violate the basic structure itself. So that is why the power of constitutional amendment has to be exercised with great caution, great wisdom, and great deliberation, because it's not an ordinary law. It is a law which is permanently going to be with the Constitution. It is debatable. I would not say that all the amendments were necessary. I don't think scholars will, I don't think any scholar would say every amendment was absolutely necessary. I don't think so. I think some of the amendments were possibly not necessary. This is a question again for debate. But I would say the power of amendment carries with it a very high constitutional obligation. As you said, the premises of that responsibility are in the preamble itself. So very good question.
Thank you, sir. We have Simarjot joining us for the next question.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
So my question is that today's Supreme Court of India shines as a glaring example of gender inequality, with 29 male judges and only 1 female judge. So is it because that there are no competent female practitioners out there, or the laws suffer an inherent bias?
I want to give you an absolutely honest answer. There is no shortage of competent women lawyers. No shortage in this country. They are as good, if not better, than men. They're outstanding lawyers. And I think, I personally think, if I had a voice, I don't know whether anybody would listen to it, I would definitely make sure that there is a substantial representation of women in the judiciary. Because of one reason, Simajot. One reason is important. While gender equality is one thing, it is absolutely, it ought to be taken into serious consideration. But there is a BBC4 interview, which I would like all of you to see when you get time on the YouTube. Two things I would like all of you to do. One is the interpretation of law by Ronald Dworkin. It's a lecture which you may find in the US Congress Library. It's one of the most brilliant lectures I've heard. And it's only then I realized that the man was a student of literature, because he was telling us about what is meant by legal interpretation, what is meant by literary interpretation. The second thing which I would like students to see is a BBC4 on the YouTube about the UK Supreme Court. And there is a snippet of Lady Hale, and she says that actually women do think differently. And it's very interesting to see how she comes across. She says very candidly, we are trained to think a bit differently. So it is important to have that perspective, I think, even in a court. And that is why I do think that we must pay attention to the number of women who should be made judges, both in all the tiers of judiciary. In the primary tier, what is called the subordinate courts, but even they're not strictly, they're subordinate in one sense, in the administrative sense. But really speaking, there is an Article 32(3), which enables Parliament to confer on courts other than the High Courts the same jurisdiction as that of the Supreme Court. So one must always know these are courts which can be one day made laterally as powerful as the Supreme Court to dispense justice. So we must have, I think, women in all the three tiers, the trial courts, the High Courts, the Supreme Court. I'm all for it. And I'm very, very proud that so many young and brilliant women have been designated as senior advocates. It's a matter of pride. It's a matter of pride. We've had some outstanding judges in the Supreme Court. I remember very fondly Justice Rumapal, again a trailblazer. So we have had very, very eminent and outstanding judges. So it's perfectly possible, perfectly doable, perfectly achievable for all of you. So more power to your elbow.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. So we have Shishir coming up with the next question, sir. Shishir.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Based on the amendment in the Constitution. So we talked about the transformative Constitution, but do you think by having amendments, especially in the Part 3 of the Constitution, such as removal of right to property, governments have actually tried to bypass the obligations that have been imposed by the founding fathers and have focused on more easier implementation of policies? So basically, what is the total view on how the amendments, especially in the Part 3, have worked out till now?
Well, you see, the right to property is, again, in the context of distributive justice as an ideal of the Constitution, I think there is something to be said for the lack of its retention in the Fundamental Rights chapter. In some sense, in a dynamic society, and in the context of distributive justice, the right to property, if it is a fundamental right, could have prevented, shall we say, the implementation of many land reform laws. Whether in fact land reform laws were implemented effectively, like agrarian reforms, is a separate question. It is a separate question. It requires, again, a different answer. But as I see it, I can see some basis for why the property right was taken out from the fundamental rights, but it has definitely it has been subjected to due process of law. In any event, it has to have the authority of law, any deprivation. So all amendments don't necessarily work out their intentions. So your question is very valid, very welcome. I think that is why I said we need self-visitation. We need to revisit what we have done. And we have to be very objective about it. We have to see whether what we have done has worked or has it not worked? And it is this willingness to actually revisit what we have done objectively, which is really the most important component of the historical process. It is also a part of the creative constitutional process. So a part of transformative constitutionalism is regular revisitation by all organs of state of how well they have done. I think, for instance, let me give you an example. I think the Administrative College in Missouri must revisit how well has it done, and what is the kind of ethos which people who belong to the administrative service bring into, shall we say, public life, or what is the quality of mentation which they actually display when they are in bureaucracy. It needs to be revisited. The same, I would say, is required for legislators. I think there is some element of dispassion which is required, whether it is the legal profession, whether it's judges, whether it is legislators. We all have to revisit. It is like cleaning up your house. Of course, many of us in India, we are used to painting our house regularly. But I think institutions have also got to sometimes give themselves a fresh coat of paint.
Adarsh coming in for the last public questions.
Good evening, sir. So there was a study by the University of Chicago that was titled The Lifespan of Written Constitutions. It discloses that constitutions in general do not last very long, and the mean lifespan across the world since 1789 is mere 17 years. So my question is, being 72 years old, what makes the Constitution of India as the world's one of the most oldest and the most enduring constitution?
Well, actually the answer is somewhat subjective, but I have to still state the answer from my heart. It was designed, this constitution was designed by the most extraordinary men. And Dr. Ambedkar, I have to honestly tell you, after reading his complete works, I kept on thinking that could any human being have read so much in one lifetime? It looks that he has compressed the lives, 10 human lives into one life. But his understanding of social behavior was so important to the fashioning of the Constitution. And we must understand that not everything which existed prior to the Constitution was jettisoned. For instance, our courts, our high courts, they were not jettisoned. We continued the rule of law structure, which was a gift. Because that was a fundamental contribution. That is, our institutions of judiciary were able to give an element of continuity in terms of values of judges, the need to sacrifice to become a judge, the judicial avocation being a calling. All this became a matter of continuity. And I would therefore answer your question. The reason why I think it is such an enduring constitution is only because of the outstanding selfless quality of the people who actually drafted this constitution. Foremost amongst them was Dr. Ambedkar, foremost amongst them. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So we have Kajal coming up with the last question, sir.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. So, sir, my question is with regards to what Justice P.N. Bhagwati observed in Minerva Mill's case. He observed that the Indian Constitution is founded on the bedrock of balance between Part 3 and Part 4. Now, recently we have seen that there are a lot of times that Part 3 comes in conflict with Part 4, and in future also there are a lot of debate going on, for example, Uniform Civil Code. So, what should be the jurisprudence in balancing Part 3 and Part 4?
You see, Part 3 is both individualistic and societal. But Part 3 must never be annihilated in the name of Part 4. That is why what is important is the invocation genuine of Part 4, or is it a kind of a camouflage for the purpose of annihilating some fundamental freedoms of Part 3. That is why, you know, ours is the only jurisdiction, Supreme Court, magnificent court in its, in the early years, the kind of contribution of judges in the field of law, the idea of colorable exercise of power, or the idea of fraud on power, was a doctrine which was evolved by the Supreme Court in the 50s. And it is such an important doctrine. So even in lawmaking under the Constitution, the directive principles are not simply meant to be quoted for the purpose of annihilating some other rights by some sort of an overt or covert fashion. So therefore, the vigilance which is required of the legal profession and the courts, in my humble view, is that Part 3 must never even indirectly be touched or compromised in the name of Part 4. A Part 4 measure, which is purely Part 4, is welcome, purely Part 4. But the point of saying that both are a balance, with Justice Bhagwati, again, he was also one of the greatest judges of the Supreme Court, very great judge. I had the great privilege of appearing before him, and I recall him. He had such a bright face. He was tireless. He had so much energy. He could, I think, continue even up to 8 o'clock. So also Justice Krishnaiah. I think many of you may not know that the vacation hearing which he did in 1974, when Mrs. Gandhi, the late Mrs. Indira Gandhi's election was set aside by the Allahabad High Court, Justice Krishnaiah heard the matter from the morning right till 6:30 in the evening. He had so much of strength and such willingness to engage with a matter. But yes, the two are two different points of view. One is individual freedom, and the other is society's objectives are actually found in Part 4. Thank you. Again, a very good question. I never anticipated. I would have been better prepared if I knew all these questions were coming, Dr. Mittal. You've clearly, your students are absolutely fascinating.
Thank you so much, sir. Request Dr. Mittal for concluding remarks.
Okay, so what can I say after such a wonderful, illustrious, great lecture, and also equally wonderful question-answer session? Well, I get reminded of Columbus. He found a new world, but he had no chart. He had faith. Today, what I learned from this great lecture is that we in India have a chart. We have a charter. All we require is to generate faith. And if we have a combination of these, then redemption is at our doors. So, sir, we are extremely grateful to you for such a wonderful and dynamic lecture. And honestly, this was expected. And on behalf of all the faculty of Campus Law Center and all the students, from the core of my heart, I thank you, sir, and wish that in near future, we'll be able to hear you again. The words of wisdom that we got will be far-reaching, definitely for me and for all the students. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much indeed, Doctor.
And thank you enough for accepting this invite and enabling a great homecoming for you. You are a son of CLC. We don't just read your courtroom genius, we practically celebrate it. And a special thanks to Mr. Andrew Black. He is greatly coordinated with us. Without his intervention, this would not have been possible, sir. Thank you again. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Raman Mittal, for allowing such great events to happen on this platform. Thank you, Dr. Seema Singh, for always motivating us, pushing us to go further. Thank you, everyone watching us, joining us in Google Meet, on our Facebook, and also the YouTube. Thank you so much, sir.